All right, so our first panel comes to us thanks to the American Baseball Biomechanics Society, Biomechanists Society, I apologize, and is a discussion about the current state of the baseball biomechanics industry. Our panelists today are Arnel Aguinaldo, Associate Professor of Kinesiology and Director of the Biomechanics and Pitching Laboratories at Point Loma Nazarene University, Dr. James Buffi, CEO of Reboot Motion, Adam Nebel, Graduate Assistant of Sports Science with Auburn University's baseball program, and Michael Sonne, Baseball Scientist with the Chicago Cubs. Our moderator is Ethan Stewart, lead sports scientist and biomechanist with the Oakland A's. Welcome.
Great, thank you, Scott. Yes, welcome everyone to the State of the Baseball Biomechanics panel. My name is Ethan, like he said. I'm moderating today with this great group of panelists that we have here, a lot of different backgrounds. So first, before we start into the questions, I'm gonna let them go through and give you just a little background on themselves and how they basically got to this point in their career with biomechanics, and we'll go left to right. So Dr. Sonne.
I'm Mike Sonne, baseball scientist with the Chicago Cubs. I did a PhD in ergonomics and occupational biomechanics at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada. I was the co-founder of ProPlay AI, now 3Motion AI, which does markerless motion capture from a cell phone. Wrote for Fangraphs and The Athletic and did a bunch of baseball stuff there that tricked people into reading my PhD thesis.
I'm Adam Nebel. I'm a graduate assistant of sports sciences for the Auburn baseball team. I am currently a PhD student there, going on my third year. I got into baseball biomechanics through my master's program at University of Arkansas, where I helped their baseball team out with their markerless technology in the bullpen, and just got an ever-growing passion for trying to make athletes better.
Sweet. Hi, I'm Jimmy. I'm CEO of Reboot Motion. I started out as a mechanical engineer and started out getting a PhD thinking I was going to build prosthetic hands. But about 2 years in, I discovered baseball pitching biomechanics research, and my PhD advisor let me switch to baseball pitching biomechanics, even though she said I would probably never get a job doing it. Yeah, this could be a long story, but I'll try to keep it brief. But during my PhD, one of the first people I encountered was Kyle Bodie, who somehow read my research and emailed me in like 2010 or 2012 or something like that. So if you Google my name and Driveline, you can see articles I wrote for Driveline's website back in like 2013. Then I went to the LA Dodgers after my PhD to help build out the Dodgers pitching biomechanics capabilities. And then in 2019, just in time for a global pandemic, I quit the Dodger job to start Reboot Motion. And Evan, my co-founder, is here. We had a great time trying to do this in 2020. But we made it through, and now, yeah, we're running Reboot Motion, doing baseball biomechanics for lots of MLB teams, and now getting into the NBA as well, which is cool.
Nice. Good story, Jimmy. Hi, my name is Arnel Aguinaldo, and I run the biomechanics lab at Point Loma Nazarene University in partnership with the San Diego Padres. In fact, we got members of my team up there. Woohoo. Before I came to Point Loma, I used to be a biomechanical engineer for Rady Children's Hospital. I ran their gate lab for a few years. So I actually got into baseball at the gate lab, where it wasn't built to do pitching biomechanics at all. In fact, this was at a time, like, it was mentioned earlier, that biomechanics was unheard of in baseball. So, I had guys all markered up. We used to use balls this big and have them throw into a net in the hallway. And, lo and behold, 10, 15 years later, we're able to integrate biomechanics in every Major League Baseball organization, in the last 4 or 5 years. So I'm very excited that, my students and students here in this conference who are interested in this space, there are a lot of opportunities for you. So, very exciting.
Awesome. And like Scott said, my name is Ethan Stewart. I'm the lead sports scientist and biomechanist for the Oakland A's. This is my third team full-time. Been with the Orioles and the Reds before this, and I did an internship with the Tampa Bay Rays. And I've been a PhD student for like 8 years or something. So we're still going. It's fine. So we're going to go ahead and start with some questions. These are all written by me. So if you have any issues with how they answer, come at me, because this is my interest in where we're at as the state of baseball biomechanics. So markerless motion capture is becoming a lot more popular with companies that we see here like Kinetrax, Semi, Hawkeye, and all the stadiums. So there's a lot going on. With that, there's also been a lot of really important single camera systems, like Mike spoke about earlier. So my question to the panel is, with these single camera systems, how do we think they measure up against the multiple camera systems, either marker or markerless? And what are your thoughts on what we can do to basically utilize those in player development across baseball? Whoever would like it first.
You guys go first. Really? I'm biased.
I'll take a crack at that. And first of all, Pro Play AI is one of the first single camera markerless motion capture modalities, I call them, that we've used in our lab and tested in our lab. And I think it's fantastic because it, basically you have biomechanics in the hand, and we call it biomechanics in the wild. So you've got the single camera system solution, you have the multi-camera solutions that you have in stadium with Kinetrax and Hawkeye, you have the in-lab systems, and then you have the traditional market-based system. So we're interested, obviously, in both the validity and reliability of all these modalities. And with a single camera system, it's obviously feasible. And when you ask that question and how accurate it is, you have to think about the metric that you're interested in, whether it's a sagittal plane motion, such as knee flexion extension, or a transverse plane of motion with internal external rotation of the shoulder, and then measure how it stacks up to something you consider the ground truth. So traditionally it would be market-based motion capture. And, Jimmy and I have discussed the controversy regarding using market-based system as a ground truth, but I digress for the time being. And then understand what the equivalence is in these various metrics, because they will vary. Some will be spot on, some of them will, be slightly off by 5-10 degrees. But I think at the end of the day is how reliable is something like a Pro Play AI or a sports box or an uplift, these single camera. And yes, they're for baseball, but we also see them in gait, for example, in clinical gait analysis. There are solutions out there. So at the end of the day, can you trust it enough to make informed decisions? And some, they'll use it, just simply monitor them over time. And the coach will say, I'm seeing some red flags here. And in the way he is internal rotating his shoulder, they'll send him to the lab, or they'll get them checked out in the stadium, where we can do these spot checks using a marker-based or a markerless system. So I think there's definitely some use in the single camera modalities that are out there, but I think as long as you understand the validity and reliability of these types of modalities.
Yeah, and something that I always think about with these measurement devices is, what is the alternative? And a lot of the times with these single camera systems, the alternative is zero data. So you can either have zero data, or you can take video and have data. So oftentimes, if I can have data, I prefer to have the data. And the other thing I say a lot in these types of situations is, they're not random number generators. They're not noise. So I know we got a lot of people who are very smart at statistics here, and because they are not just noise, I think, like Arnel said, the accuracy might not be quite the same. The reliability might not be quite the same, but because they're not noise, then I think it's just a matter of finding the signal in the noise. And sure, there are some metrics where it's going to be really hard to capture them. They're going to be very noisy. But then, like Arnel said, depending on what metric you choose, you can find metrics that are reliable, that are accurate enough to give you what you need. So I think it turns into an actual statistical challenge to get the signal from the noise.
Yeah, kind of echoing off of both of those conversations on that. A lot of what we see in my role for collegiate athletics, we'll go on the road. We won't have access to a stadium system. We'll be on the road for 2-3 series in a row, and we don't have any biomechanical data. So we have to use what we can get our hands on. If that's a Pro Play AI, if that's Uplift, whatever it might be, something is better than nothing. Even if that's just taking two iPhones and setting them up on tripods, no data actually collected in terms of numeric values, we at least have something to go off of the next time we do that. As long as we're repetitive in what we're doing and collecting the data similarly, it gives us something when we have nothing. So I think there's definitely a space for it. And it's growing exponentially in how we can go about using it.
And Mike.
And me, yeah. No, I think every point you guys made is excellent. One of the unintended consequences that I've seen, like since moving into this space and being with a team, even going to conferences, is how many people have come up to me and said that was their first exposure to like getting access to biomechanics data. And then, you know, they move into a role with the team and they have access to like a way more robust system like Kinetrax or anything like that. Like it's given them at least a feel for it, right? And it's not the first time they've ever used biomechanics data. So I think like, you know, if you're looking for a single camera system to replace a multi-camera system or a marker-based system, like you're not asking the right question, right? It's how can you fill in those gaps? Like, you know, in the perfect world, you have a single camera system for when you're, you know, at the plyo wall or you're doing something like that. And then you can kind of say, all right, we need to get this guy in the lab and then get more data.
Yeah. And I think just to add my 2 cents on the end, if I may.
Yeah.
I think one of the really cool things about getting into this space is we're no longer trying to publish research all the time. We're not looking for the most scientific method that's going to give us exact numbers. We need something that's reliable and applicable. That's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for something that we can utilize, that we trust. It doesn't have to be the exact same, but as long as we can see a trend and we know what's happening, it's a lot better for us. When I find a 2-degree difference with a marker motion capture system, I can't go tell my coach to make an adjustment for 2 degrees. You can't see that with your eyes. But being able to measure those things and be able to apply it, to be able to just use it in those small settings is what's really important for me on the applied side, getting away from trying to write my scientific articles all the time to get published like I did in grad school. So you start to weigh those options.
And I actually wanted to make one more point about it too, is the space is moving super fast. I mean, computer vision at its core is artificial intelligence, it's neural networks. As everybody knows, those are super hot right now. GPUs are exploding, compute is exploding. So if you have an opinion today, it might be outdated tomorrow. So I would also encourage people to keep up. You know, if you came up with your opinion on markerless motion capture, single camera motion capture 2 years ago, your opinion is definitely outdated.
So building off of this, are there specific differences that we see between those single camera systems looking at pitching versus hitting? Are there things that it's better for one versus the other? And this can be more of a broad spectrum. I'm not expecting you to tell me exactly how you use it for yourself, but just in general, do you see any differences between the quality that we get from those?
You want me, I go first this time? Yeah. No, I mean, like typically like the frame rate is going to be important. So like the slower the movement, chances are better you're getting, the more occlusion, the chances are like the data is going to get worse there. So, you know, in certain ranges of both the pitching delivery and the swing, you're going to get better data. You know, as you start wrapping the hands around the body or something like that, that starts to deteriorate a bit. But I mean, both movements, a lot of similarities. You typically see similar findings.
Hitting data is noisy, regardless of whether you're using a $250,000 system or a $1,000 iPhone with a good package behind it. That makes it that much more difficult to extrapolate anything, really, from at least my standpoint in like trying to take something directly to the coach. You have to have so many trials, and this is where those single camera systems do play a good role, is that we don't have to have somebody take a bunch of swings on our game field. We can take that single camera into the bullpen or into the hitting facility, and we can get motion capture there. It gives us that much more data to then help us make better determinations. So just padding on to like what's most useful in certain situations, trying to answer our questions.
Okay, cool. I think it's important to remember too that for every event in a game, there's a pitch, but there's not always a swing. So we get a lot more data on pitches just for obvious reasons, right? So completely switching topics, but I think builds into this swinging. With the addition of the bat path metrics to StatCast data, how can not only teams utilize this, but the people in this room, how can we start to utilize that information to make more decisions or gain more insights into what's happening at the plate?
Who wants to give up their secrets?
I'll try to speak in most general terms as I can. I think taking the bat metrics, whether it's through Hawkeye or, the blast motion, one of these modalities that we use is understanding the relationship between the body, the biomechanics, and the swing itself. You can have, quote unquote, improper or bad kinematics and kinetics, however that's defined, but still make good contact and it's a hit. But understanding that from a statistical perspective and trying to find relationships between what we see in the ground, the ground reaction force, the kinematics, the kinetics, as well as these bad metrics, I think is very helpful for the coaches and the S&C and athletic trainers to make some really good informed decisions where it's not just the performance side, but potentially even some injury risk in various joints of the body. And obviously it's not as prevalent as we see in pitching, but it could certainly be an issue for some of the swings that we've been seeing. And I think for baseball hitting, biomechanics of baseball hitting itself, I think that's where the research, because that's our primary goal in the lab is to perform, scientific research on these types of analyses. I think that's where the space needs to move. I think that's we really need to understand a little bit more from a biomechanical perspective on the hitting side, in addition to obviously the pitching.
Well, I would say, I think the most exciting thing about having bat path metrics available now, it kind of reminds me of when the pitch FX data first came out. Now everyone here has access to those data, and you've got access to the ball flight data that came before it. The most exciting part is what everybody's going to do with it now, right? It's we are now turning that data over to the general population, that people who are not maybe traditional biomechanists are going to get a shot at interpreting some of this stuff. And when you start hearing different perspectives on it, that's when I think some really exciting things start happening.
Yeah, and I could say, I don't want to talk too specific because I've had a lot of conversations with people that have really specific ideas here that they're excited about exploring. But I want to say generally what I think is exciting. So I think I mentioned during the intro, but my background is mechanical engineering. I've learned stats over the years, but with bat path and ball flight, what was cool getting into baseball is I could use some of my skills as a mechanical engineer in terms of fluid mechanics, dynamics, even simple projectile motion, which I think people generally learn in high school. So I think that's really cool, is you can actually apply laws of physics to understanding baseball, which I think allows you to then maybe explain things a little bit better to a coach rather than just putting something into a random effects model or something like that. So I think that's what's really cool about having the bat path and the ball flight and pairing them together is you can use things other than stats.
Yeah, kind of echoing what Mike said, just data availability in general, giving everybody the opportunity to answer your own research question, however that might be. And if you find something cool, then use it, publish it, put it on Twitter. People might disagree with you, but that's room for growth too. And it's room for growth for the entire sport.
No one would ever disagree with you on hitting Twitter. That's a very civil place where everyone
Twitter
gets along.
scientists, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think just make it publicly available and figure out what you can figure out.
Yeah, I think we're at one of the cool junctures of baseball biomechanics because we're handing the data out. We're going to see a lot of ideas. This room will come up with thousands of better ideas than I'm ever going to think of. And just being able to see those in all the different forms is probably the most exciting thing for me, is seeing what we can build and grow from just now allowing this data to get into other hands. Because I have a very specific view of how the swing should look as a biomechanist. And sometimes I'm completely wrong. And that's where new ideas can really refreshen what we're starting to look at. All right, staying on the same path of data. College data is becoming much more prominent. We have TrackMan, we have Kinetracks, we have PDP, any markerless biomechanics, but where there's so much more information getting to teams and getting to people. So when we're looking at this data, what have we learned in terms of the delivery and the collection of the data, and how can we basically determine the do's and don'ts of interpreting and analyzing that data, as a team, but more just general, because I'm not trying to put Mike on a bad spot here, giving me all the secrets.
You guys go ahead.
So yeah, and this is more just a general topic. Just as we start to see this information grow, like where do we see what we can do and what we shouldn't do with this types of
Are
information?
you thinking more on the college level or just pretty much in college pros?
College, the pros, we've had it for a little bit. This
Sure.
is now starting to blow up more for the college and amateurs.
Well, speaking specifically for our program, we're a Division II program. Our baseball team went to the World Series a couple of years ago. And as far as I know, we're the only D2 program that has a fully fledged biomechanics labs dedicated to baseball. And a lot of it is, yes, we're biomechanists. So, my grad students are amazing in performing kinetic analysis of movement. But we're learning just as much from our coaches and what our coaches, our pitching coach, our hitting coach, what they're looking for in their eye, and be able to understand data from TrackMan, from blasts, and even just from force plate data. I mean, I have coaches who tell them start preaching and teaching their players about vertical and medial lateral and AP ground reaction force, which I'd never heard a coach talk about before. But marrying the two, and from us as a biomechanist, I mean, we get so much data that we have to simplify it so that the coaches have actionable information that they can use. And that part of it is what we're trying to learn. It's like, let us operationally define A, B, and C that the coaches are seeing on the field, or, even in their TrackMan data. And we kind of have our go-tos, our A, B, C, and D. We've been here for a week. We've collected data on over 30 guys, and we're having a powwow tonight. We call it a PowerPoint party, and we're just going over reports. And I'm telling each of our students to give me A, B, and C. That's it. Out of the 50 biomechanical variables, I want just 3 or 4 that you think is most unique for this player, for this pitcher, or for this position player if they're hitting. All right. And so a lot of that is learning from our coaches, learning from the staff on exactly what they're looking for. And overall, the program and our lab grows that way.
I got a don't and a do for you, Ethan. And they're going to lead into each other.
Love it. Love it.
So I think the don't, as we get data on college kids and younger, is don't assume someone's mechanics are static. People change a lot over time. I think when I was at the Dodgers, we did some studies just to see in general how people's velocity progressed in the minors, and people generally gained a couple of miles an hour through the minor leagues, not even counting college. So I think if you're using the data to try to scout or predict, I think that's a really important thing to remember, is that people will change a lot, especially as they're coached, especially as they grow. So the don't is don't assume that someone's mechanics are static, which leads to the do, which I think is really cool, is we can do more longitudinal studies now. So like it used to be where like the biomechanical data was only available at the major leagues. These are well-developed adults. So we have like data on one set of people, but now we can get data on those people going back to when they're, 18 years old, and we can track them all the way through to, if you have a long career, 37 years. So, we can have longitudinal data to better understand how things change over time. So that's what I'm really excited about.
I would say just like similar do's and don'ts. Understand the limitations of the people, and then also the limitations of the programs that you're potentially going to work in or work with. Markerless motion capture in game for collegiate athletics is rapidly expanding. I'm very thankful to work with a team who has that capability, and we just started utilizing it to its fullest capabilities 2 weeks ago. It's very, very new. It's very fluid, and that's across the board. Some of the integration aspects of it, you're still just working with athletes. from whatever lens you want to work with an athlete, you're still just working with that athlete. Some athletes respond better if you're talking directly with them. Some athletes respond better if you talk to them through a coach. And then bringing data to their level, whatever that might be, like understanding what their foundational knowledge is and trying to get them to the level that they need to be at in terms of understanding what you are wanting them to.
I think what Jimmy was asking is if Scott's going to install a system at Williamsport for the Little League World Series. So, yeah. All right.
He's in.
Yeah, and with this, like the important thing for us is we're getting more and more information. So we have to be able to bring it all in, but then pick out what is the most important thing. There's a huge shout out to MLB here now with the draft combine. We're getting a lot more players. We're seeing a lot more data on these guys. So now we have to learn the best way in the professional level to ingest that and utilize it to its maximum potential. And like Jimmy said, it's important to know as guys go through their careers, they adjust, they change, they get stronger, they get bigger, they mature, their bodies change, and understanding how that affects everything that we're trying to look at and trying to measure it at a level of college and high school guys trying to draft them on based where they're at. All right. This is the most hard-hitting question I'm gonna ask. And I have an idea of some of the thoughts from the panel, but what is the next big thing in baseball biomechanics, in your opinion, from your area of expertise, your area of work?
Everybody looks at me first. I think I think the idea of moving biomechanics from being like a discipline to being a tool is probably like the most important next phase of biomechanics, right? Like we talk about all these data points and, you know, we see what that was an Essen, was it? Yeah. So we see all these data points, we see ball flight, we see spin rates, all these things. But like, I think sometimes people forget that there's like a bag of meat with electricity running through it that's making those numbers. And there's a lot that can happen with people that can change things. Like somebody's having a bad night's sleep because they just had a baby or something. Like it's using biomechanics as a tool to measure things that may be changing in other space. And it's like including that in the toolbox for any analyst to solve problems. I think that's going to be the best, like biggest shift.
All right, I got something for you. I don't. You're gonna try and predict what I'm gonna say?
Nope. Keep it in my brain.
So the next big thing, I think there could be a lot of big things. I'll give two, since I can't pick one next big thing. I think one big thing is just doing stuff at scale. I think biomechanics has very traditionally been on like very small cohorts. 10 pitchers, you know, in a study. You know, over the last few years, we've gotten lots and lots of data at the major league level, and people have been trying to do it more and more at scale. But I still think there are challenges with that I've seen doing it at scale. But again, related to what I said about like AI and compute and all those things, like continuing to get huge and compute getting easier and easier to find. I think people are going to be able to build bigger and bigger models and do larger and larger studies. And I'm really interested to see, even if people do start to lay artificial intelligence on top of biomechanics. So I think just doing things at a very large scale. And then I think the second big thing that I think is really interesting is connecting intent to biomechanics. I don't know if this is necessarily the next big thing, but I think it could be a really big thing. And I think like some of the eye tracking with hitting maybe starts to get at that, or like understanding where a pitcher is trying to throw the ball versus where they actually throw the ball. But I often think of baseball as like going farther and farther back in the process. You know, when it first started, we were just like looking at the runs on the scoreboard. Then we were looking at things like strikeouts and walks. Then, you know, we were looking at things like ball flight, spin rate. Then we started looking at, okay, what is the body doing? Figuring out what the body's doing. Now can we go one step further and figure out what the brain is doing to tell the body what to do? So those are two things that I'm really interested in.
Actually, I'm really excited about where the research paradigm in biomechanics is moving, especially in baseball, specifically baseball pitching, because as you know, shoulder and elbow injuries, but pitching related injuries are still prevalent. That's an issue. And part of the thing with biomechanics, and I find this with coaches, is that they assume that we have the answers as to why these are occurring. And we use a mode called inverse dynamics to estimate the reaction torque at the shoulder and elbow, but it doesn't tell us what the individual structures are responding to. And so I know Jimmy for his PhD did some of this work, right? And even for, I studied bioengineering at UC San Diego, and we're very kind of what we call micro mechanical level, where we look at tissue properties and skeletal, musculoskeletal issues, and using musculoskeletal model to understand the relationship between what human movement is doing on a macro level to what the individual structures at the elbow, for example, UCL, the lateral structures, all of that is be able to respond to those torques that are imposed. The thing that everyone understands that the harder you throw, the greater those torques go up. It's inevitable. And so how does one respond? How does someone like Joe Musgrove be able to pitch for so long and have the same amount of torque as some other guy who had 2 Tommy Johns? So I think that where the space as the technology advances, where we start to utilize some of these musculoskeletal models and be able to trust it a little bit more to make decisions on. We see this on the clinical case side in some spaces. I think that's the very exciting part. As a nerd in a lab, I think that's a paradigm that's going to happen. I think it's going to happen quickly. Teed it up for you.
I could talk a little, yeah, sure. I can talk a little bit more about that. Yeah, and I do think that, yeah, again, what is the next big thing? And I think there are a lot of cool directions things are going. But yeah, for a long time, like Arnel said, baseball has been just looking at torques, elbow torque, shoulder torque. But the thing is, the torque doesn't tell you what exactly is happening to the individual structures. The torque around the elbow doesn't tell you what is happening to each of the forearm muscles, which is what is happening to the ulnar collateral ligament. So I think if we truly want to understand these injuries at a deeper level and actually try to prevent them, which hasn't been super successful, is really start to understand deeper than just the net torque on a joint.
Yeah, just a quick question. How much torque does it take to tear UCL?
Everybody knows this number, right? Cadaver studies say in the 30s of Newton meters.
Okay, in the 30s. And how much do we typically see in a baseball pitch?
In the hundreds.
So every single pitch, we're creating enough torque around that elbow to tear a UCL. Why aren't we tearing them every pitch? So it's about what Jimmy's talking about, the muscular structure, everything else that's happening around that joint. So sorry to interrupt.
That's how you trick someone into reading your PhD thesis, right?
To echo some of what was already said, like data availability and just figuring out having access at all levels is going to be the biggest thing in biomechanics. And it's not so much just from how well can we predict who's going to do well when they get to AA, AAA, major leagues and going through those systems, but it's going to give us that much more data to try and answer some of these questions of why haven't we been able to predict elbow injuries? Why haven't we been able to save people's careers when they're coming back from elbow injuries? So seeing how many pitches we actually have, how many swings we actually have, and having that number exponentially grow as more and more systems get installed and we start to see more and more people on those systems at all different levels, it's just going to give us that much more of an idea of what we could be looking at versus what we're looking at now.
Yeah, and I'll give my quick one because it leads into my last question before we'll take some questions. Question for questions. Mine is just the fact that we're starting to open up this data source, right? For the longest time, I've been the only person in an organization that sees a lot of this information, and our analysts and our research and development team, like we're all looking at it, but it's just us. And now we're starting to see this field and this area just kind of explode where everyone wants information, everyone's starting to get more. So for me, it's about where we're going to go next. And it's the coolest thing is just we're getting data into hands of people who haven't seen this type of information before. So what can you come up with? What can you create that's going to change how every team, college, high school, every pro team looks at this information? What can you all do with that information that's going to basically just change the path for all of these pro teams and what we can do with player development and just creating better athletes? And that leads into my very last question. with this, and don't give away your secrets, not stuff you're trying to do in-house, not any big research projects you're trying to publish. But if you could take this public information data and you could just talk to the crowd here, what's something you're interested in that you might not have the time to do? Or just something with that you think would be a really cool research project that could be handled with this new information that they can now use?
I think something like the injury surveillance system that we use in Major League Baseball and even NCAA, if we start adding more, I guess, biomechanics specific type of data, and we begin to understand the relationship between the incidence and prevalence of the various injuries that we experience in baseball with specific biomechanics. I take a page out of ACL research, for example. There's a ton of epidemiological research on ACL research because biomechanists followed athletes longitudinally over time and actually measured things like knee varus moments during a cut or a single leg squat, and the kinematics associated with a counter movement jump, and understand the relationship between the incidence of these various injuries and the biomechanics. And the data is already there, and I understand that some teams don't want to share their data. I get that, but I think ultimately it's going to help the sport as a whole to really understand what's going on under the hood, if you will, with these various injuries that we're seeing. Because at the end of the day, you can't perform at your top level if your incidence of injuries, in this case, pitching-related injuries, is still pretty high. We're looking at 73% last I checked. So it's something I think that if we can borrow a page from some of these epidemiological models and be able to apply it, and I know there's some early work that's being done on this. I think that's the exciting part moving forward.
Yeah, I think to Arnel's point, I think one of the hardest things about studying injuries is pairing the injury outcome with the biomechanics data. So if there can be more sources for paired information, that would make the research a lot easier. Because that's always the first step, is how do we even pair these things? And when did this person first get injured versus when did they show up on the disabled list or the injured list, I guess.
Taking a step away from the injury paradigm and trying to figure out why people are tearing UCLs. I am very interested in situations and situational baseball, what's changing from pitch to pitch, why it's changing, what's changing from day to day. And that's a shameless plug for my presentation tomorrow, if anybody wants to watch that. But ultimately, why do some guys succeed and some guys fail in high pressure situations, or bottom of the ninth, 3-2 count? Why do they swing and miss?
Buckle transducers on every muscle and tendon. So we can replicate what Jimmy's done in the past. No, Jacob, my director, told me not to answer this one. Sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the coolest thing is, and I understand I have to be very careful in answering this question for other reasons. But when you're looking at these, we've studied the pitch path forever. We know exactly how it comes in. We know how it moves. We know everything that's happening there. But now we're starting to get the bat path data paired up with that. Why is that successful? Why is that swing work against this pitch? Those types of things are the questions that I now think we can start to actually investigate at a larger scale. And I'm not giving anything away from us, but just start certain things that we can start to think about.
Yeah, I got a kind of a boring one, but I think it's also an important one. Related back to what we were chatting about with people who have been using torque for a long time, torque around the elbow, torque around the shoulder. I think what people often don't think about is so you calculate torque, not to get too deep into the math, but these systems capture position. We have to take the derivative to get velocity, then we have to take the derivative to get acceleration, and that introduces a lot of noise into the process. And then you have to do filtering and pre-processing to then turn that into a torque value. And I think, back in, the 90s, some of these first papers came out and started using these filter parameters and pre-processing steps. And I think people have just continued to use them, even though the systems have gotten different and better, and the quality of data has gotten higher, and the frame rates have gotten higher. So it's boring, but I think truly understanding the appropriate pre-processing and filter parameters and things like that, and to truly understand like what is an actual like ground truth torque number. Because like you filter it at 18 hertz, you're going to get a different answer than filtering it at 25 hertz. I mean, when I first started my PhD and I was just calculating it without filtering, I was like, wow, my numbers are wrong. And then I was like, oh, let me just put the filter on. Oh, now my numbers are right.
Buckle transducer.
Buckle transducer. Yeah, but it's boring. But I do think it's really needed in the field, and maybe we'll have to have time to do this at Reboot Motion if Evan lets me. But understanding the appropriate pre-processing steps to use when calculating these types of things, and not just for one system, but can we do it for each system? Because like every system is its own animal. Kinetrax is different from Simi, is different from markers, is different from Hawkeye, is different from single camera motion capture. So truly understanding like what are the correct, or as correct as we can get, pre-processing steps for getting information out of it.
Wow, it's a lot more in depth than I thought we'd go. Yeah, so that is it for my questions here. I think we'll start to throw it to the audience for questions. Do we have?
Burning questions.
Meredith got that hand up
Are
real
we
fast.
passing this on or?
Do we have to turn it on? Is it ready to roll? You want to throw it?
Oh, literally throw it.
Literally throw it.
All right.
Uh-oh.
Who's-
Oh God. Oh God. Oh jeez. Hey. Hey.
I think so. The top is an actual mic.
Is it
Right.
really?
Doesn't sound like it.
Test.
Yeah.
One thing that you hear a lot is you're talking about core pitches and that. Tend to deal with players that standing still when you get like very good information, for where you want to put them in a lab setting to actually get like marker capture. Next thing is that they're out for a while, they're getting work and what is and you can't get on field dynamics in the lab, or it's harder to just like actual motion. It's not about ways to, for instance, take the actual biomechanics and translate to things like injury practice, or for understanding about how players are moving on the field and then taking it back to biomechanics. Because it seems like we might be able to use what's happening on the field and connect it to some kind of like say the players developing, learning how they're then, changing what they're doing or what's changing about the body. How use, I guess, the simpler data and learn more about.
Like the center of mass tracking, like the
Information. But if it's not like I don't know if we're getting back to them things to say across all the minor leagues.
yeah. We want to talk about physics. Yeah, I don't know how deep we can get, but the conservation of momentum, conservation of energy, if we just look at how that point is moving and accelerating, we can understand a lot about the momentum and energy that's going into the system. And I think we can learn a lot about efficiency, possibly just looking at how that center of mass is moving as it's acquiring energy and then breaking as it's maybe transferring that energy. So that could be really, I mean, I haven't done that, but it sounds really cool.
Well, I think with the markerless motion capture, whether it's a single camera, Hawkeye, Kinetrax, Simi, it allows us to basically bring the lab to the field in some instances, right? All Major League Baseball stadiums have them. A few minor league stadiums have these systems, and Jimmy and I have been working on these equivalence analysis for some time now, and then they're at the point where we can trust the kinematics and the subsequent kinetics that are estimated often there, where we could potentially tie, and we're actually doing it already, tie in, player performance, injury risk, as well as what they're doing in the lab. And what we're doing in the lab is just, we're trying to confirm certain patterns, kinetic patterns that we're seeing on the field, and then be able to correct them. I mean, we can apply optimization models to these, for example, to better trust, I should say, the Hawkeye or the Kinetrax or the Simi data. So as we collect, more and more of this data, I think it gets to the point where the validity and reliability is high enough where we can begin to trust it and then start to make these types of decisions.
Sorry. Yep.
Are major league players getting changed by what you're saying? What's the scope? How often?
I could talk since it's not current. It's outdated information. But yeah, so yeah, I'm sure this is okay to talk about now. So when I was at the Dodgers, I was there from 2015 to 2019. It did get to the point where we were doing daily, at least I was doing the pitching stuff. So it did get to the point where we were doing daily reports on the mechanics of the pitchers, and just there would be flags if something was out of the ordinary and something was changing, and that would go to the pitching coach. And there was always a level of like coach intuition between the data and the player, because obviously the coach has so much more, obviously, like all the context. But yeah, it was at the major league level making a difference for the major league pitchers. Yeah. Yeah.
What's the other level?
I can speak to that because I've come from the smaller market teams in my career. Yeah. So I think it's the gap is closing rapidly. That's what I'll say. So
Yeah.
Teams are buying into these things. They're hiring people to run these. And from the minute a player gets inside an organization, they're being measured to see what's going on, how their swing works, how their mechanics work on the mound, and they're working to do whatever they can to make that pitcher have the most success through the organization. Whether they can get them to where they can be a AAA starter and throw a ton of innings and be really valuable there, or whether they can get them to the big leagues. Like, we're trying to make each pitcher the best version of themselves while keeping them from getting injured. Same thing with the hitter. We're trying to make them the best version of themselves. That's from the minute that they get signed by the team.
So I could talk about how we do our hitting analyses at our company. So every night we do an analysis of every single swing. But yeah, the feedback generally happens only like once every 2 weeks or so. So like every night we are looking at every swing, but then the coach will then like every 2 weeks check in on how did the last 2 weeks go. And that's when they have the session to see. So yeah, it's what we've seen is it's really hard to do it on like a daily level. But then a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks seems to be a good amount of time where you can have a check-in every so often and do the same kind of thing.
Part of the reasons why we teamed up with the San Diego Padres is because they wanted something where, a facility such as ours just focuses on the biomechanics. So we're only one part of the equation. So, we meet regularly with SNC, with athletic training, with the pitching coach, both on the major league and the minor league levels. And we just go over 5 or 6 reports together. And I say, okay, this is the reason why biomechanics is effective is because we call it a modifiable risk factor. We can modify that. We can't modify intrinsic risk factors if we're talking about pitching related injuries. But there's some things that could be potentially modifiable. But the coaches, they obviously have to buy into it, and they're they're on the front lines. Obviously, they're day to day working with our pitchers, and it's their job to help. Part of our job is also translate the biomechanics data, but also they then applied the ABCs that I talked about earlier, just to help player 1, player 2, player 3, and we see it. We actually see it. If this guy gained 4 or 5 miles per hour on our 4 seam, it's because something happened here in the kinematic, something happened in pelvis, something happened here at the knee. It could be very minute, or it could be a combination of that and what they're doing in the weight room. that could potentially lead to these performance metrics that are often defined by these kinematic and kinetic metrics. So again, we're only a small part of the equation, and it really becomes much more of a holistic approach to optimize player performance and reduce the risk of injury. Yeah, exactly. I can only speak for the Padres, but yeah.
I would say in my 7 years overall, you see a huge shift in that. In the beginning, it's a pushback because it's almost a little bit of this data is trying to take over my job and keep me from doing what I do. I'm very open about this every time I speak. My job is to just put one number that tells the coach exactly what they're seeing. 95% of the time, 99% of the time, the coach knows exactly what's happening at the plate or on the mound. All I do is I put a number to that so that when we try to make an adjustment, we can say, hey, we made this much of an adjustment and we have an objective number instead of just having a bunch of subjective reports. So my job is just put objective information to what they're really good subjectively seeing.
So I know you guys are talking about things, I'm wondering how do I other aspects you're making based on what is it apply
Minimally.
Minimally, but that's just based on what technology and data is available. As that data becomes more available, that will be more applied for sure.
Yeah, and it is just there's not a lot of tech in that space yet. We've done a ton of running research in the history of biomechanics. Yeah, it's a little bit easier for base running stuff, but fielding there's just.
We've done a little bit in catching, like a pop-up, for example, and trying to understand what's, how can a catcher get to second base as quickly as possible? What are those kinematic and kinetic predictors of, performance in that space? And then we're still trying to learn that a little bit more. Obviously there's a paucity of data in regards to catching related biomechanics, but that's something that, human movement is human movement, and biomechanics is just physics applied, statics and dynamics as applied to human movement. So you choose one and see, we've got the technology, we've got the resources to quantify those. And then it's our job to kind of pinpoint which one of those are important predictors.
Yeah, the data does exist though. It's in the low frame rate feed for Hawkeye, which nobody looks at. The data does. Yeah, the data does exist. I think it's just a question. It's like a business question of it's usually a lot more bang for your buck if you spend time.
Sorry, bro. We have 14 cameras in the minor league facility. We're tracking 19 segments on every single person.
Yeah.
Umpires, coaches, base runners, everyone.
So that you can get the strikeout mechanics.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, we have that. Perfect.
Yeah. So I think the data does exist. So if you're really interested in that, it could be a really interesting way to differentiate yourself.
Great.
Yes. Written a lot of say in the lab work being done with say jump efficiency or gauge analysis to say think of some of these think of an outfielder running or you get an infielder jump efficiency.
No, actually, it's quite the opposite. We do quite a bit of CMJ, cutter movement jump testing, looking at things like rate of force development, reactive strength index, and jump heights. And there's a ton of research that shows just jump performance efficiency, for example, leads to better performance on the field, not just in baseball, but in football and basketball. So we have a ton of tools that are available to the average Joe with a couple $100 to measure things like a vertical ground reaction force using a couple of plates or an IMTT and an isometric mid-thigh pull. And so we do a performance testing for about 5 minutes before they come in to the lab, and then we got what we call their pre-gait or their pre-movement analysis, and it's see how that ties into their overall performance on the field.
Also on that, for the fielders and hitters, it's the most data that we're going to collect on them is in our sense at Auburn. We're going to collect more counter movement jumps on them, grip strength testing, range of motion, functional movement screenings, all of that pre-participation stuff is going to be much more valuable or much more analyzed than anything else that we really can look at outside of just tracking and total distance, some high-speed exposure stuff, but it gives us a better idea week to week of how that athlete is responding to that previous series. Are they upset because they just went 0 for 10 at the plate over 3 games, or are they crushing their vertical jumps in spite of that? And then that gives us an idea of like mentally, physically, and holistically, how are they actually reacting to the things that they're going through.
Yeah, it does seem like there's room for some advantage to begin understanding like first step quickness and things like that. So yeah, definitely it seems like some room for people to do some cool research.
I can't answer that question. Is the mic working?
I think it works. Does it work?
Yeah.
Okay.
Ooh.
I swear I'm not trying to
Right.
make this hard on you guys, but Ethan, I know the A's just made a couple of like hires and expanded their analytics department. You know,
One of those is here, sitting up top.
awesome. I know there's a lot of great scientific commitment to scientific inquiry that we're hearing, but this is also in the context of last year, the commissioner of baseball said, you know, described analytics as something that was doing damage to the game. He was talking about an arms race to nowhere. And, you know, and then in June, like there were additional comments about whether or not baseball should be cutting in analytics departments and cutting down the sizes, or whether or not they should be basically farming it out to vendors. And so I think the question maybe more for everybody in this room is about like, you know, what does the future look like? Respond to the commissioner if you feel like it, but really like, you know, is there pressure on you on deliverables to basically like, you know, you don't have to tell us what those are, but essentially like answering to, you know, the general manager or the president of baseball operations, making the owner happy, showing that you have results that matter and make a difference on the field. Do you feel that pressure? And related to that, what do you think is the future then of your whole field of, you know, baseball inquiry?
I can go. Yeah, I mean, I definitely felt this when I was at the Dodgers, and you know, I have a company now, and like people pay us based on whether they think we're valuable. So that's a really great incentive for us. But yeah, to your point, I think especially when I started at the Dodgers doing this type of thing in 2015, it was super open-ended. You know, it was kind of like it was more like a PhD project than it was let's do something that helps us on the field. And that's like an area where I do feel like there's a lot of room for improvement. And I think it happens in our company, it happens in companies, is you forget how important the product manager is, the person who has the customer's interests in mind and wants to take it from the R&D to the thing that makes the difference. So I would love, yeah, I mean, we're talking about hiring this exact kind of person at our company, but I would love if teams, rather than spend more on analytics, they spend more on product managers who are really good at building things that people like to use and want to use. But it's a great point.
Yeah, I'll speak on my side. I'm not worried about where I'm at. I'm very comfortable with my organization. We're putting a lot of emphasis in making sure that we get the best product that we can out to our players. Because now it's less about organizationally what we can do, but it's about what our players want, what our players desire. Because players know about this information now and they want to have it. They want to see it. They want to have these conversations. And that's where the value comes from this, is what the players need, what the players want. That for me is where the most important thing is. I'm going to stay away from talking about what teams have done in other places, but I'm very confident in that the players now are the ones driving these conversations, and the players are the ones that want this information. So as long as the players are here and the players want this, like I'm employed for a player. No matter that the team pays me, I wouldn't have a job if it weren't for the players wanting this information and getting value out of it.
100%. I mean, I think players today, and I can speak from our organization, they're analytics driven, they're data driven. I had one pitcher who wanted to do a pen without TrackMan. He refused to do that. So I think in terms of confidence, as long as ownership and the coaches understand that analytics, biomechanics, they're tools. It's tools. At the end of the day, the manager, the assistant managers, all of them, the coaches, they're going to make the decisions. Is whether or not they can make some trustworthy, informed decisions, so that at the end of the day, it's all about wins and losses, right? It's a very competitive world here, and if you can leverage the analytics along with the experience of their coaches and managers, those are the ones I think would be the most successes. I mean, taking point with the Padres, you mentioned they were top 7 in all these metrics, but they're also 1-11 extra inning games. And that's the reason why they didn't make the playoffs. At the end of the day, after all that, what was the situational awareness? What were the mechanics involved in that prevented them from making the playoffs? Hopefully we turn that around this year.
There's been one question over there for a very long time.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, man.
Where'd you take that, Jimmy?
So the question was, are there data privacy concerns and data ownership questions? And yeah, talk about the next big thing in biomechanics. What's that? Oh, I thought so. Yeah, so I do think so. Ethan was saying that he's for the players, but in reality, like, the data is owned by the owners and teams generally. And I do think that there could be a lot of improvements made towards like universally accessible data by the players and the teams. So everybody has equal access, can do what they need to do and want to do. So yeah, there's going to be a lot of questions about this.
I can speak to that real quick. So with the Major League CBA and the Minor League CBA, now every player has to sign a wearable technology agreement to agree to use that information. So if there's an agent out there that doesn't want their player using it, they just basically say they won't use that piece of tech. So every player has the option for most of these sports science techs now to say yes or no.
Yeah, I would also add to that, like, one interesting point. I know a couple of people who have left working with teams and now work for agencies, like doing the exact same role that we'd be doing with a team. They're doing that for their clients at the agency.
All right. So we're going to go ahead and wrap it up. I know I will be here most of the day today, but if you have any questions for us that are outstanding, feel free to come up to us. All of us are very talkative, so just expect to stand there for a while. But thank you so much for listening to us, and thank you, Penny.